What if the silence of the forest isn't empty, but actively listening, holding its breath as you pass through? 3 old college friends, Liam, Maya, and Chloe, sought to recapture a spark of their younger, more adventurous selves. Their plan was simple: a reunion camping trip, deep within the reputedly serene embrace of Blackwood Forest. They craved the crackle of a campfire, the shared stories, and the illusion of being the only souls for miles. But Blackwood Forest had other ideas, and the silence they sought was already occupied. Their laughter and optimistic chatter filled Liam's old SUV as they drove, leaving the city and its predictable hum far behind. They were chasing a memory, a feeling of unburdened freedom, but what they were about to find would cast a long, chilling shadow over any nostalgia. The deeper they drove into Blackwood, the more the well-maintained roads gave way to rutted dirt tracks, then finally, to little more than a suggestion of a path. This was what they wanted, or so they thought: true isolation. Liam, ever the enthusiast for the authentic experience, had pinpointed a spot on a barely legible map, promising a clearing by a stream, far from any designated campsites or meddling park rangers. The beauty was undeniable. Ancient pines towered like silent, green-robed giants, their needles forming a dense canopy that dappled the forest floor in shifting patterns of light and shade. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Yet, beneath the surface of this idyllic scene, an almost too perfect quiet reigned. Birdsong was muted, the usual scuttling of small creatures strangely absent. It was a stillness that felt less like peace and more like a held breath, awaiting. They parked and began their short trek, the initial excitement still bubbling, unaware that they were walking towards a threshold into a story that had already begun without them. It was Chloe who stumbled upon it first, during an exploratory walk while Liam and Maya were wrestling with setting up the main tent. Not far from their chosen clearing, tucked away behind a dense thicket of rhododendrons, was another campsite. But this one felt different, wrong. It wasn't ancient. The ashes in the fire pit looked only a few days old, perhaps a week at most. Yet it was clearly abandoned, and hastily so. A ripped tarp lay half-collapsed, cooking utensils were scattered as if dropped mid-use, and a tattered, weather-stained journal lay open on a mossy log, its pages filled with cryptic, paranoid entries. Words like "watching," "they know," and "the eyes in the trees" were scrawled in frantic handwriting. Stranger still were the symbols carved into the bark of the surrounding trees, unsettling, geometric patterns that none of them recognized. And then, propped against a tree stump, as if carefully placed, was a child's worn, antique-looking porcelain doll, its painted eyes staring blankly ahead. An immediate cold sense of unease washed over Chloe. She called the others. "It felt like we'd walked into the middle of someone else's nightmare," Maya would later recall, her voice hushed even in the retelling. The remnants spoke of fear, of a sudden flight, leaving a chilling question hanging in the unnaturally still air. What could have made someone leave like this? They tried to rationalize what they'd found. Probably just some messy campers who got spooked by a bear, Liam suggested, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. The state of the site, however, hinted at something more than a startled retreat from wildlife. The journal entries, though fragmented, painted a picture of escalating paranoia, of unseen observers, and a growing certainty of being unwelcome. The symbols carved into the trees weren't random graffiti. They had a deliberate, almost territorial feel. Chloe, usually the most pragmatic of the group, felt a prickle of genuine fear, a primal instinct to retreat. Liam, trying to lighten the mood, joked about local legends he'd vaguely heard, tales of forest folk or reclusive communities that supposedly lived deep within Blackwood, shunning all contact with the outside world. Rumors even suggested that some hikers who ventured too far off the beaten path either never returned or came back subtly, disturbingly changed. At the time, it seemed like just another spooky story, perfect campfire fodder. But the image of that doll, its fixed stare seeming to follow them, began to etch itself into their minds. They retreated to their own campsite, the earlier excitement now tainted with a shared, unspoken apprehension. The forest no longer felt merely empty. It felt occupied. As dusk began to bleed through the canopy, painting the forest in hues of grey and deep purple, the atmosphere around their own small clearing began to shift. The usual evening chorus of crickets and frogs was eerily subdued. Instead, other sounds emerged, subtle at first, easily dismissed. What sounded like soft, almost inaudible whispering seemed to drift from just beyond the reach of their firelight. It was too indistinct to be words, more like a sibilant sighing of the wind, yet there was no breeze. Twigs snapped intermittently, not the random cracking of settling wood, but a rhythmic punctuation in the darkness, seeming to circle their camp. Liam, ever the skeptic, blamed it on small animals, but Maya and Chloe exchanged uneasy glances. The tension was palpable, a tight coil in the pit of their stomachs. They huddled closer to the fire, its flickering light a fragile barrier against the encroaching shadows and the unsettling sounds that seemed to be drawing nearer. The stories they had planned to share now felt trivial, childish, in the face of this creeping, intangible dread. The breaking point came when Maya, needing to retrieve something from her tent, let out a small, stifled gasp. Liam and Chloe rushed to her side. There, placed neatly on her sleeping bag, was the child's porcelain doll from the abandoned campsite. Its blank, painted eyes seemed to glint in the beam of Maya's flashlight. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through them. This wasn't there when they set up. No one had gone back to the other site. The implication was terrifyingly clear. Someone, or something, had been in their camp, had entered their tent, and had left this disturbing calling card. Someone was sending a message, Liam whispered, his earlier bravado completely gone. And it wasn't friendly. The whispers outside seemed to intensify, swirling around them, a chorus of malice just beyond their perception. The forest was no longer a neutral backdrop. It was an active participant in their growing terror. The doll was a declaration, a sign that they were known, observed, and profoundly unwelcome. The whispering grew more defined, no longer a vague sigh but a collection of hushed, guttural utterances, seeming to emanate from multiple directions at once. It was impossible to pinpoint the source, making it all the more unnerving. They extinguished their campfire, plunging them into near-total darkness, hoping to make themselves less of a target. Through the thin fabric of their tents, they saw them, fleeting shadows, darker patches against the inky blackness, moving with a deliberate, unnatural gait between the trees. They were too tall, too purposeful for any forest creature they knew. Liam, fueled by a surge of adrenaline and fear, finally broke. He scrambled out of his tent and yelled into the darkness, "Who's out there? Show yourselves!" For a heart-stopping moment, the whispering ceased. The shadows froze. An absolute, profound silence descended, heavier and more threatening than the sounds that had preceded it. It was the silence of a predator that has been noticed, pausing before it strikes. This was no longer about spooky stories. This was about survival. A sudden, loud crash from the direction of the abandoned campsite shattered the stillness, the sound of something heavy being overturned or deliberately smashed. That was the final straw. "We're leaving. Now!" Chloe hissed, her voice tight with terror. They scrambled, stuffing gear haphazardly into bags, their movements clumsy and panicked in the oppressive darkness. Flashlight beams cut erratic paths through the trees as they half ran, half stumbled back towards where they'd left the SUV. The whispers resumed, no longer tentative, but closer, more distinct, laced with a chilling, almost taunting quality. And then, the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, pacing them in the darkness, always just out of sight, snapping twigs and rustling leaves with an unnerving rhythm. It felt like a pursuit, an escort out of their territory. Rumors they'd once dismissed now screamed in their minds. Tales of the forest's guardians guiding unwanted visitors out, or sometimes deeper into its embrace. Every shadow seemed to conceal a watching presence, every rustle of leaves a step closer. They burst from the tree line, fumbling frantically for the car keys. Liam's hands shook so violently he could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, a jarring, mechanical sound in the otherwise silent, watching woods. As they fishtailed out of the clearing and onto the barely discernible track, Chloe risked a look back. In the fleeting sweep of the taillights, she swore she saw them. Multiple pale, indistinct faces watching from the dark edge of the forest, unmoving, unblinking. They didn't speak, didn't stop, driving with a desperate urgency until the first glimmers of dawn touched the sky, and they found themselves back on a paved road, the ordeal feeling like a fever dream. They never reported the specifics. Who would believe them? The story of a haunted doll and whispering shadows would sound like a fabrication, the product of overactive imaginations, but the three of them knew them. Blackwood Forest kept its secrets, jealously guarded by whatever lurked within its whispering pines. Some places, they learned, aren't meant to be found, and some silences are filled with things best left utterly and profoundly undisturbed. The question of who, or what, inhabited that deeper part of the forest, and what became of the people who left that tattered journal and their child's doll, would continue to echo in their nightmares, a chilling testament to a reunion that went horribly, terrifyingly wrong.